This episode of Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast, is sponsored by Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company with 10 of the world's leading brands, including Carnival Cruise Line, Cunard, Holland America Line, Princess Cruises, and Seabourn. To learn about the world's leading cruise lines from Carnival Corporation and great vacation options, contact your travel professional or visit worldsleadingcruiselines.com.
It's Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson. There's a presidential election next year, which you probably didn't need me to tell you. Right now, there's something like 24 Democrats and 1 Republican, if you don't count the incumbent, and maybe by the time you download this, there will be more of each, racing around the country in a desperate struggle for press attention, campaign money, the loyalty of as yet uncommitted campaign staffers, the support of top political figures, at least those not contemplating their own runs for president, and oh yes, almost forgot, voters. Especially in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. The Iowa caucuses in January, followed in February by the New Hampshire primary, and then the South Carolina primary, are the first electoral contests of 2020, so it is with those voters candidates are looking to make an especially deep impression. Except that those voters don't always turn out to be who you think they are. Meg Kennard, who covers South Carolina for the Associated Press, tells us this story about the current campaign.
There was a couple that I started seeing all over the place. I saw them at events for Kamala Harris. I saw them at events for Cory Booker and Pete Buttigieg and I think even Amy Klobuchar. And they just started popping up. And I remember it got to the point where we would kind of give like a knowing smile or glance like, oh, hey, you're here too. You know, and it wouldn't just be huge rallies. It would just be these kind of smaller town hall-ish kind of events. And I finally went over to these guys and I was like, wow, you guys are like the most visibly involved voters that I've encountered. And I see a lot of people, but I keep seeing you. Where are you from? I mean, are you from Columbia, which is pretty centrally located? You know, is that how you're able to get to all of these events all over the place so easily? And they're not even from here. They're from North Carolina. I think they live in Raleigh, and they literally have been coming down to South Carolina what seems like just about every weekend since January, since most of the campaign announcements began, just to do what they can't do in North Carolina right now, which is just specifically to come and hear from these candidates that are literally flooding the state just about every week. And that's when it kind of hit me. I realized that people are making that trip. They're coming here. Some of them, the most involved of them, are coming to places like South Carolina specifically just to see the politics and just to see it all happen. And that was a pretty neat takeaway. And I've seen them since, and they're still coming. And they say that they'll keep coming, you know, through the election.
That's right. Primary election tourism. It is an actual thing. We'll hear more from Meg Kennard later in the program, but first to Concord, New Hampshire, and AP correspondent Holly Raymer, who's covered the primary for better than 2 decades. Holly Raymer, every 4th winter, New Hampshire has a gigantic influx of visitors. You get presidential candidates, you get campaign aides, you get journalists, you get support staff for all of them. Plus, you also get, I understand, visitors, people who want to see this process not on television or hear it on the radio, read about it in the papers, but want to see it close up. I mean, who comes?
Well, it's really a whole range of people. I mean, there's a pretty long history of people traveling to New Hampshire specifically to see the presidential candidates. Years ago, I spoke to a man from Massachusetts, and he had been organizing what he called political safari day trips to New Hampshire since 1992. So a few days before the primary, he would rent a bus, and he would take people to Manchester, which is sort of the center of the action. You know, early on, he would try to research other attractions in the area that people might want to see, and he quickly learned, like, nope, just stick to the campaign trail because that's all they want to see.
So none of the typical tourist stuff or other state attractions?
Right, no. They were interested in seeing candidates, and that was it.
Now, about 10 years ago, you wrote a piece about how the tourism division of the state government actually tried to promote this as a visitor destination, which actually didn't get very far.
Yeah, the state tourism division was considering building a whole marketing campaign around the primary. I was at a conference in 2007 where a tourism official was describing plans to create a website, a press kit to direct campaigns and media to the best locations for their events, and even a podcast featuring a fictional candidate who would travel around the state. But when I called Secretary of State Bill Gardner to get his reaction, he basically called them up and just said, no, you can't do this. So the Secretary of State sets the date for the primary and is known as this really fierce defender of New Hampshire's position. And he just hated the idea that this marketing campaign might further this misconception that the primary is a cash cow and the state's only in it for the money. So what he said to me back then was the presidential primary was not created for an economic benefit for this state. People can come take a look at our leaves. That can be encouraged, but the primary is not the same. But people still come. In 2016, one of my colleagues spoke to people who'd come from as far away as California and Colorado who would really just squeeze in viewings of multiple candidates over the course of just a few days. And I remember going to a John Kasich event that year, and someone stood up and tried to ask a question and mentioned he had driven up from Maryland to see the candidates, and Kasich said to him, "You're not even from New Hampshire, wait until it's your turn."
But a lot of people, I mean, if you're from New Jersey or California, I mean, it's really never your turn because usually the whole thing is over by the time it gets to you.
Right, and that's what some of the people my colleagues spoke to said, we don't want to wait. We have questions, we want answers, we want to be here where the action is.
And they also, I guess New Hampshire's small enough where more of a chance to actually meet a candidate.
Right. And it's a small state. You easily could travel around to multiple locations, multiple candidates in one day if you planned out a route pretty carefully.
Is there any sense of return visits when it's not the presidential election, when it's not the primary campaign? Do people look around New Hampshire in January and February and think, yeah, when the weather gets warm, this actually might be nice to come back to?
I'm not sure. That's an interesting question. I suppose if they're skiers or they like the snow, they might consider coming back. The candidates certainly are here already year-round, so they're getting to see the state in all the seasons. But for the folks who wait until right before the primary, they're only getting a very small view.
Do people from New Hampshire sometimes feel that visitors are crowding them out, or are there simply not that many of them relative to the number of people that are at these campaign events? Yeah,
I don't think you would get the sense that it's a huge influx and they're taking over events. I will say, having covered a lot of these campaigns, being so close to Massachusetts, a lot of people do drive up from Massachusetts. It's not a big deal to hop in the car and come up here. And so, as I talk to voters in the audience at events, I quickly learned to ask people where they're from before I even start talking to them, because I'm looking to interview New Hampshire voters, and I seem to always have a knack for picking out the Massachusetts people. So I've had to learn to ask first where you're from.
Okay, and in all your experience, have you figured it out yet?
No. No, I think I still end up with lots of Massachusetts people who I still will chat with, but they're probably not going to make it into my stories.
So if you're coming from out of state, because you want to see the show, you want to be part of the circus up close, what are your options? Are there published sources that tell you where you need to go? How do people follow the trail?
Well, I think now it's pretty easy to just search online and find out the candidate schedules. Some of the various media outlets have candidate tracking websites that do a pretty good job of listing all the events.
Do visitors track media as well? I mean, do they come to see TV stars?
I don't really get the sense that they do. I mean, I think when some of the big sort of name network people are here, they generate interest, but I'm not sure that people come specifically to see them.
There's a lot of complaining in the rest of the country about the New Hampshire primary. Why does this little place get such an outsized role in choosing who are presidential candidates? But on the other hand, because it is a small environment, you kind of get a chance for presidential candidates to do the kind of retail politicking that they so rarely get to do in the general election. Is that a show that draws a lot of people in that way?
I think so, because you could come to New Hampshire and see a candidate in a number of different settings, even in the same day. You might see them at a small diner. You might see them giving a speech to a larger crowd. You might see them at a business or a rally. So it's not just the big kind of televised speeches. You might get to see what they're like in a variety of settings.
And New Hampshire takes this very seriously. This position, this is an important public responsibility.
Yes, and this will be this election will mark 100 years of New Hampshire having the first primary. So this year in particular, I think folks are celebrating that and celebrating that tradition. And
given that on the Democratic side there are enough candidates to fill practically a whole baseball roster, does this mean, gigantic crowding, or what do you think?
Crowds in terms of who's turning out for events?
Crowds in terms of who's turning out for events, crowds in terms of who's professionally coming to the state?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly been very busy for the last 6 months even, and only getting busier as we head into the summer. So you're starting now to see campaigns setting up offices around the state, hiring more staff. So yeah, it is definitely getting a little bit more crowded.
You've covered a lot of presidential campaigns. I've covered a bunch of presidential campaigns. Do you get the sense of when people come to visit just to see the show of the campaign, does it make you wonder, why would you do this? Why would you spend your precious vacation time seeing this? Or are you able to step back and say, yeah, this thing that I do, I guess it's kind of fascinating, kind of important?
Yeah, I do. I think it is interesting to look at it from their perspective because, I try to do that myself. I'm a New Hampshire native. I've been covering campaigns for AP for 22 years, so I have to remind myself this is a special view that I have that not everyone gets to have. And it is unique and it is fascinating. So it doesn't surprise me that people would want to come see that. And for the story that I did years ago, I talked to a political science professor from LaSalle University in Philadelphia, and she thought, she sends some of her students up here to volunteer for campaigns, but she thought primary tourists made sense, and she said, look at Philadelphia, like we sell ourselves as the place where the Declaration of Independence was signed and millions of people come here and school trips come here, so why shouldn't New Hampshire and Iowa have similar, tourism campaigns?
Exactly. So you pointed out that Manchester is the center of the action come primary season. Are there places that non-New Hampshireites might not know about that you think make a good place to go if you're coming to see it?
Well, I mean, Manchester makes sense as the place to sort of have your home base. That's where the airport is. It's the state's biggest city. That's where the campaigns generally have their biggest offices, and you can kind of get everywhere else from there. But I think going further north, seeing some of the scenery, getting to some of those smaller towns is good, assuming the candidates get up there. But, I once did a story sort of tracking where the candidates go, and the vast majority of their stops were concentrated sort of in the southern third of the state.
Holly, thanks so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
You're welcome.
Holly Raymer covers New Hampshire for the Associated Press. After a break, we'll take in the view from South Carolina. And on my favorite trip, we look back at a more innocent time, 2016, for a father-son road trip to see the presidential campaign circus up close. This is Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast.
Download the AP News app for the latest in news, sports, travel, entertainment, and more. Available now for iPhone and iPad.
It's Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson. The South Carolina primary usually comes in March. Next year's is actually February 29th, which is late enough to be spring in the Palmetto State, where Meg Kennard fills us in on what it's like to visit to watch the contest unfold. Meg Kennard, you've covered a lot of South Carolina primaries. It's early in the primary season. The weather is nice. March is generally a spring month in South Carolina. So do you see, obviously you see an influx of reporters, you see an influx of technicians, you see an influx of political operatives and volunteers. Do you also see people who are coming in to take in the show up close?
We do. South Carolina really does have a unique position in all of this in terms of not only being an early voting state, but also a very popular tourist destination. People come here from all over the world for the beaches, for the mountains, for everything in between. And particularly in this political season, we are seeing a lot of people come here for kind of a best of both worlds scenario. They want to come to South Carolina anyway. They want to experience the low country and all the different kinds of uniqueness that there is along our coastline in particular. But they're also coming to do what you can only really do here and a few other places, and that's see a lot of these campaigns and candidates up close and personal. So, yes, there are a lot of reporters. There are a lot of people like me who are wandering around trying to find candidates and pin them down on issues. But they're all are also these kind of political tourists who are coming here to check out something that you can really basically only get in South Carolina right now.
Is there any kind of organized political tourism going on?
Not that I have noticed thus far. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I would imagine that a lot of the county parties, particularly in some of those high intensity tourist destinations, such as along the coast, for example, I would imagine that they do get phone calls from people, perhaps party activists in their home areas, looking to come and take in all the sights, as well as take in perhaps maybe their secondary hobby, which would be politics. So I haven't seen an organized, kind of a tourist organization to really kind of get people on a travel schedule, so to speak. But we still have a little ways to go, so maybe that'll happen.
So what does a political tourist get out of being in South Carolina instead of staying home and watching it on television?
They get the chance to not only get a selfie, which has become a thing. That's like the most popular thing that happens after these political speeches is the selfie line. But they also get a chance to get to in front of one of these candidates and ask them perhaps a burning question that's on their mind, to share a personal anecdote, to give them a piece of their mind in terms of what's important to them as a voter. We see oftentimes a lot of these anecdotes make their way into candidate speeches in terms of, well, I was traveling the state of South Carolina and I met this person who told me this, and that becomes kind of part of even a localized stump speech. And so even if you're not a South Carolinian, if you do come to one of these events, you have that same chance to really impart on one of these candidates what's important to you in this election and why you think they should care about it.
Since the candidates, of course, are campaigning for the votes of South Carolinians, do they make a distinction between people who live there, people who can vote there, and people who are just visitors?
Oftentimes there is a very localized angle to a lot of these speeches, picking up on an issue that's specifically germane to South Carolina. I don't think necessarily that the candidates on the stump are campaigning super specifically just to people who reside in a certain state. Obviously, they're here because of the primary voters. They're here because of the people who could cast a ballot to push them further toward the Democratic Party nomination. But in general, we seem to hear somewhat of a less specific message when candidates are on the stump. There will always be something that's thrown in that's local. And some of these non-stump meetings, I mean, if it's a smaller event where a candidate is sitting down with a specific group or an organization that really they feel they need to kind of get their opinion on something, that's less general and can be very much more specific. But certainly if somebody is coming here from another state and wants to get a sense of where a candidate stands on any variety of issues, regardless of what state in which they're a resident, they're really going to be able to get a pretty good sense from listening to just about anything that's happening here.
So has it ever become a problem for you I mean, I'm thinking of your after a rally, after a press conference, after whatever, you're looking to get local reaction to this candidate, and you buttonhole people who went to it, and you keep discovering that, oh, well, no, I'm from Georgia. No, I'm from Colorado. I just came in to visit to see this.
Yeah, that can be pretty frustrating, particularly for events along the coast in those high tourist areas, and also pretty much anything that's close to one of our borders with another state. I often encounter that, not necessarily with the Democrats, but particularly with Trump rallies. When President Trump comes to town, I have a pretty hard time sometimes finding someone who's actually from South Carolina so I can speak to them about whatever's going on. It also becomes a lot tougher on college campuses because our universities and colleges here as everywhere draw students from all over the place. So that can be very tough in terms of trying to find someone who's actually a registered South Carolina voter. But certainly going to an event in Charleston or in Beaufort, in Hilton Head, in the Low Country, that can be somewhat difficult because those are the places where people are coming here literally from all over the world to enjoy. And it can be a little bit tough to try to find a South Carolina specific voice.
Okay, Meg Kennard, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Absolutely. Happy to join you.
Columbia-based Meg Kennard covers South Carolina for the Associated Press. And now, my favorite trip. We're going to stay on topic for this one. Lloyd Green has been to New Hampshire many times. He's worked for the George H.W. Bush campaign in the 1988 primary there. He canvassed for Mitt Romney on Election Day in 2012. But in 2016, he made a different kind of trip. He took his 12-year-old son, Danny, from their home in the New York City suburbs for a personal look at democracy in action in New Hampshire. So, Lloyd Green, you've worked primary campaigns in New Hampshire. You canvassed for George Bush in 1988. So what made you want to go back as a tourist?
New Hampshire in the winter is actually a really nice place. That's one thing. And the second thing is there's just a great feel about the process. It appears, and it is, open to everyone. It's a small state. You get to see a lot. And if you're a parent, it's also a great way to teach your kids something about America, teach your kids something about politics. And so that's why New Hampshire in February or January is actually a good place to be.
So 2016, you went there, and who did you bring with you?
I went up there with my son and another dad and his child, Danny's friend, and the four of us ended up spending 3 days up in New Hampshire taking it all in.
Was this something that the 12-year-olds had angled for, or was this something that you wanted to show them?
I think it was more of a dad's thing, and the 12-year-olds went along, and a road trip for a 12-year-old is a great road trip. We left from Westchester, headed up to New Hampshire, and it was a several-hour drive, but there were things to do, there were things to see, and it was easy to get up there.
So what'd you see in the time you were there?
We ended up seeing Bernie Sanders talk. We ended up seeing now President Trump at a rally, and we also caught Senator Ted Cruz at a local local restaurant up in New Hampshire.
Are you able, New Hampshire is famous for its retail politics, for the chance for people to actually get up close to the candidates. Did you get that opportunity?
We had that opportunity, particularly with Senator Cruz. He was at a local restaurant, and after he spoke, all four of us went up and talked with him, and he was available and he was accessible. So that's about as good as it gets when it comes to retail politics.
Right. What was that like? What was the conversation like? What did you learn from it?
It was really chit-chat, more along the lines of introducing our boys to the candidate than anything else. How much of an impression it left, I can't vouch for it, but it was just a reminder that these folks who are running for office are also very much flesh and blood and very much people. And if you go up to New Hampshire, you could see them up close and personal.
Now, you've not wanted to go to Iowa or go to South Carolina for early primaries as well, or for caucuses in the case of Iowa?
I've wanted to go to South Carolina. I just have not had the opportunity to make it down to South Carolina for the primary. But that's definitely something have loved to do. So far as Iowa goes, its structure doesn't lend itself to what I would call primary tourism, particularly given just the weather and the time of year. It's a bit bleaker, frankly, than New Hampshire is. New Hampshire may be cold and may be snowy and stuff may be coming down, but it's easier for at least us to get there, just given where we live.
So what'd you learn traveling in New Hampshire as a visitor instead of as somebody working there? Did you feel the tug of, I really should be working on this, or were you happy to just go as an observer?
I was happy to be a spectator because, in essence, we all got to hang with each other. I got to hang with my boy. But even more than that, I was not working, which is probably the best thing about it. I was being a tourist. Instead of going and seeing the Washington Monument, I was watching a campaign. And that can be fun. Just not having to be on is a great thing.
You recommend it for other travelers?
Oh, yeah. I would definitely recommend it, particularly for folks with middle school age children and high school age children. The parents are going to be voting anyway, or one would hope, and their children are queuing up in the not too distant future to be voting as well. And so it's an opportunity to see the process up close and personal in a way they might not otherwise, in a way that you don't get it from television. And you go up to New Hampshire, you watch a campaign, there is, to one degree or another, electricity present or not. And if electricity is present, it's just something to note. It's one of those things that reminds you of why people get into campaigns in the first place, why people become spectators to campaigns or support a candidate as well. And by the same measure, if you're going to an event that doesn't generate that kind of buzz, that may tell you about what you're also watching on television or reading in the newspapers or reading on the internet as to why someone is or isn't doing well.
Yeah, it's another bit of insight. So the now 15-year-old boys, how do they regard this trip? Is this something they talk about, they remember warmly or not? How did they see it?
I think they view it as an episode. I don't think it's anything that they're going to linger on. In the case of my son, I can say it was something he remembers, but definitely not something he talks about. In the case of the other boy, I think he is going to spend a week or so down in D.C. this summer at a program for high school students. So it may have left a mark, but I can't speak for him.
Okay. Well, Lloyd Green, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time to do this.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome, Warren.
Lloyd Green lives near New York City. He's worked on several presidential campaigns and visited some others. And that's the show. Get Outta Here is a production of the Associated Press, produced under the supervision of Nikessa Moody and Peter Costanzo. I'm Warren Levinson. We'll see you next time.
This episode of Get Outta Here, the AP Travel Podcast, was sponsored by Carnival Corporation, the world's largest cruise company with 10 of the world's leading brands, including Carnival Cruise Line, Cunard, Holland America Line, Princess Cruises, and Seabourn. To learn about the world's leading cruise lines from Carnival Corporation and great vacation options, contact your travel professional or visit worldsleadingcruiselines.com.